In 1962, the same year as the first Walmart, S.S. Kresge, which was a huge nationwide variety store chain based in Detroit, they start their own new discounting concept, K-Mart. K-Mart, they were the gorilla, and they were really well run and were willing to take losses and have lower margins. The way Walmart won is because the problem wasn't the mindset of margins. It was that they came out of these existing operations and they used the existing logistics backend and distribution backend for their stores. And at first, that was by far the best. So within 5 years, by like 1967-ish, Kmart has 250 stores all across the country doing $800 million in sales. And the new Walmart concept, Walmart revenue was still only around $10 million at that point in time. So they are like a gnat 5 years later. And Kmart is like darling of Wall Street.
Because they're having to build everything from scratch, like go negotiate with every single manufacturer of every item that they sell, try and figure out how to warehouse it, figure out the logistics network for the very first time.
Yeah, and they're like in Arkansas and Missouri in like a regional area. Kmart's now everywhere. Like they could just leverage this network that they had, all their distribution back end, and like go everywhere all at once. But the problem was that all of their existing distribution backend was tailored to the old model. It wasn't tailored to this new model of store. And that worked fine when there was no competition, but it wasn't lean and mean, focused on getting the lowest cost, most efficient operations possible, because they weren't that worried about margin on the back end. So as Walmart starts to build out on their own, going from chaos to building out their own distribution network, they're always 100% laser focused on lowest cost possible, most efficient possible, as much cash flow, as much inventory turns as possible. Like they had to be. The only way they were going to grow was if they could get excess cash flow to grow, to invest in new stores. The only way they could do that while keeping prices low was to make their operations as efficient as humanly possible.
Because they were not taking outside capital, so they had to only reinvest cash flows coming out of the business.
Totally. Sam has this amazing quote. He says, "The things that we were forced to learn to do because we started out underfinanced and undercapitalized in these remote small communities contributed mightily to the way we've grown as a company. Had we been capitalized, or had we been the offshoot of a large corporation the way I wanted to be," because remember, he wanted to do the deal with Butler Brothers, "we might not ever have tried the Harrison or the Rogers or the Springdales or all these other little towns we went into in the early days. It turned out that the first big lesson we learned was that there was much, much, much more business out there in small town America than anybody, including me, had ever dreamed of. And of course, that they built their own logistics network to service it."
It's very clear that what they did was, to quote Chaitin at Benchmark, the sort of go slow to go fast. They had to build a lot of infrastructure early, but they're really obsessed with getting the operating costs down on a sort of per unit basis as much as possible so that as they do reach big scale, they can continue to be very, very profitable. It's interesting that there's a dual-pronged approach here between lean, mean, focusing on getting your costs, every penny you possibly can, down because your margins on selling these items are going to be so thin. There was a second component, though, which is be a great merchandiser. You both have to be super operationally efficient, but you have to be a good merchant too. And part of this was Sam's spidey sense for what consumers wanted and making sure that they were sourcing that from vendors, that they were putting stores in the right places. I mean, we haven't talked about the planes yet, but this is probably a good time.
Oh, yes. Let's talk about the planes.
So Bud was a pilot in the war. And pretty early in the book, Sam talks about that he and Bud owned like 20 planes over the course of Walmart's life, but only one was a jet, or sort of later they became jets because early on,
when they didn't have any pilots,
they had no pilots. So early on, what they would do is the two of them would take prop planes, fly to places to survey where they want to put a store. They would identify from the air what seemed like an interesting location.
by flying sideways.
Sideways so they could look out the window down at the town directly below them. And then they would go and figure out who owned that land and negotiate with them. And it was this, we can do it ourselves. We can do it super lean. And we are not going to like hire any middleman to like go around to all the towns for us and identify spots. No, we'll just fly over them and figure out where we want to put a store. And we'll figure out how to reach consumers in a way that is like bringing them the best merchandise at the absolute lowest operating cost to us.
Totally. When I read that story, I was like, oh, this is amazing. CEO of company decides he needs a plane to be able to travel around faster. He's spending too much time in the cars. And you're like, oh, okay, here we go. And then Sam's like, I'm going to buy a secondhand prop plane with a washing machine motor, and I'm going to learn how to fly and fly it myself.
Amazing.
I was thinking also about this whole incredibly important piece of the Walmart story where they literally build their own infrastructure for everything from scratch. And it reminded me of what we talk about all the time on the show, right? Of the Jeff Bezos, don't build your own infrastructure, focus only on what makes your beer taste better. And I think we now have to have a caveat to the Bezos law.
Ooh.
Which is that, yes, that is true in most cases, but if what you're doing is like in a whole new area and best in class infrastructure for what you need doesn't exist, in a case like this, the infrastructure actually can make your beer taste better.
Oh, if it's actually your core competency? Yeah, I mean, this is new core competency that actually did need to be done in-house. Most of the time that argument doesn't hold water. But if it truly is core, which this did become core to beating K-Mart and all the others and having much better economics of them at scale, then yeah, you have to do it in-house. All right, so discounting. Well, they grew the number of discounting stores pretty dramatically up through their 1970 IPO, and people still weren't really paying attention because they were this company in the southern Midwest. They seemed regional. But let's just take you through some figures. By 1968, they had 24 stores. They filed to go public in 1970 with 32 stores and around 1,000 employees. And the public markets, the reception, the bankers, like this was not a household name. So even though it was a consumer brand, you would sort of treat it the way that you treat it like an enterprise IPO today. It's not like the Airbnb IPO that gets a lot of reception. Some stats on the actual IPO. Well, first of all, it was postponed because the market fell apart on them, much like many startups are going through right now. But in October 1st of 1970, it went public. Only 800 shareholders participated in the IPO. They sold 300,000 shares at $15. So that's sort of the actual IPO the night before. And some quick math shows they raised $4.5 million in that IPO. It started trading for around $15.60, so they had a modest little pop the next day. But they really were not having meaningful research coverage. A lot of the research coverage they were getting was kind of skeptical. It sounds a lot like Amazon's research coverage early days, as if this whole house of cards could fall apart at any given moment. The next year, in 1971, they did grow top-line revenue 77%. So despite the Walmart that we know of today, where they're a very slow growth company. And I say that not to criticize them, but because we're often talking about pretty new tech companies on this show. But if we look at, the 2010s, the annual growth rate for Walmart is in the 2 to 3% range. So not a fast growing company by top line revenue by any standards now. But shortly after IPO, despite not attracting a lot of attention, that was not the case.
No.
We'll link to it in the show notes, but I pulled open the 1972 annual report, which is a gem.
Oh, such a good find.
And compared to the stuff that you need to write now for your annual reports, which is mostly compliance stuff that you don't want to even page through. This is remarkably legible. It's a pretty thin document. Most of it seems to be written from Sam himself. They grew 77% their first year after IPO. In fact, by 1977, the market cap was still only $135 million as a public company, growing quickly 7 years after IPO.
In 1977, they did $500 million in sales, growing at that rate. I did some math on the CAGR by decade. So Walmart's compound annual revenue growth rate for the whole decade of the 1970s was 40.1%, 40.1% for the whole decade. And then in the 1980s, it was 32.4%. And that was starting from like a $25 billion revenue base.
Those 2 decades propelled them to be, and somehow still hold the crown for the highest revenue company in the world. You look at Amazon and some people that you think might be approaching, but still not better.
Still, Walmart is king.
Yeah.
So there's really 2 last really important pieces of the story that I think we need to fill in here. One, kind of during this period, actually starting like right after those first early years of the first Walmarts, and that is computers. So
yes,
this is wild. In 1966, so just 4 years after the first Walmart goes in, Sam Walton, who at this point is 1966, he's just about 50, he's like 48 years old, I think.
Yep.
He starts hearing about computers because he's always got his ear to the ground. He's talking to everybody. He's always looking for new ideas.
He's cheap, so he doesn't want to spend money on computers, but he's starting to get the sense that in the same way that discounting disrupted everyone that came before in the variety store era, computer back-end retailers were probably going to disrupt the classic retailers today who don't use computers.
So he goes up to Poughkeepsie, New York, and enrolls himself as chairman CEO of Walmart in a seminar at IBM on how to use computing technology in business. There's a great quote from a guy named Abe Marks, who was president of the National Mass Retailers Institute and was also at that seminar. He says, "Without the computer, Sam Walton could not have done what he's done. He could not have built a retailing empire the size of what he's built, the way he built it. He's done a lot of other things right too, but he could not have done it without the computer. It would have been impossible." And then Sam right after that says, "Much as I hate to admit to something like that, I expect Abe is probably right."
I love that. I literally had that in my notes too, so I'm glad that you grabbed that quote. This was the start of Walmart becoming a technology company. They were always interested in experimenting with the most cutting edge stuff, but Sam didn't understand technology well, but he understood the benefits of technology. And so the way that he made sure Walmart could sort of benefit from this is he always left the door open for smart, tech-savvy, younger people to come and have big jobs at Walmart. And then he would push back aggressively on their plans and say, like, do you really think that we need to move our whole inventory system over to computers? That's super expensive. Like, convince me that we need to do that. But the fact that he went to these conferences and rolled in this stuff, created this headcount, meant that he was open to it. He just wouldn't be the one to make the decision because he probably wouldn't have picked the right technology choice or might have done it too early or too late. And so I think this was like an interesting compromise for him to do this. Later on, there was a proposal made for a $24 million satellite network, private satellite network, specifically for Walmart.
This was like pre-dial-up. This was in the 70s, right?
Was it that early?
70s or 80s. Yeah, I think this was in the 70s and 80s.
Oh, yeah, you're right. 1987. So let's see. Market cap at this point is probably around $10-20 billion, somewhere in there. So they invested $24 million to link all stores with a two-way voice and data transmission and a one-way video communication from Bentonville. And basically, there was not enough bandwidth available on any other communication lines.
Yeah, whatever was being used at the time.
To sync back in a very fast manner all of the sales data from stores. And, you know, we talked about how Sam is obsessed with getting the data as quickly as possible and learning from it and disseminating those learnings. They ended up okaying a $24 million proprietary satellite network. And then because Sam had this philosophy, remember, he thought it couldn't scale past 15, 20 stores, of needing to sort of visit all of the stores himself and have that personal communication. The satellite network enabled Sam to sort of virtually visit these stores from the home office and broadcast satellite transmissions of himself. And they eventually instituted this for the Saturday morning meeting too, where he would broadcast over their proprietary satellite network in 1987.
So the satellite network becomes part of this, but this whole technology investment, computerization, it's even more than just information sharing. It gets back to what I was saying about logistics, about efficiency, about margins, about keeping prices low, and about beating competition. So as they start to invest in computers and they start to bring the talent into the company to do this, including the first person who Sam brings in, who he meets at this conference, a guy named Ron Mayer, who ill-fatedly Sam would briefly make CEO of Walmart.
Then discover he was not ready to retire.
Yeah, exactly.
Which is a very TSMC story.
Totally.
Similar to Morris Chang.
And he's very gracious to Ron in the book. He says, like, look, the problem was me. I was not ready to retire. But Ron and the team that he builds in the technology, they build the first concept of a distribution center. Think K-Mart is like great. They have warehouses, right? Like you would order goods from your vendors, from your suppliers. They come into a warehouse, and then you'd ship them out elsewhere. But like they just sit in the warehouse and then you'd pick stuff up from the warehouse and go elsewhere. Walmart, as they're investing in technology, they start taking daily individual orders for custom, whatever SKUs in whatever amounts each store in the Walmart network needs. They buy in like big bulk in big packaging from their vendors. That comes into what used to be called a warehouse is now called a distribution center in one side. Walmart does a whole bunch of stuff in the middle of the warehouse. They unbox all of the stuff. They take it out of the packaging. They rebox it up into the individual orders for each individual store every single day. And then they ship it back out the other side, customized to each store. And then originally they were doing this with common logistics carriers like UPS, FedEx, or other carriers. Then they start building their own trucking lines. And so they can just get so efficient with this. So this is how, as Walmart starts to expand out from the South and from the Midwest across the country, and Kmart is just going off city by city, extending their supply lines, Walmart's got this behemoth of a distribution network that is way more efficient. And so when they go head to head in a geography, Walmart can price lower, still be making a profit, and Kmart just bleeds cash in those stores.
Yeah, it's amazing how far Walmart has come because the first store didn't use a distribution center. They would have to order from all the manufacturers and all the vendors.
Dropship directly to the stores.
You can only sell what you have in the store. And so when they opened the first distribution center, what they basically did was, because they saw the growth of cities moving outward, so like the suburbs are starting to happen, they would build a distribution center, sort of like hub and spoke. They would pick the city that they wanted to go into that was furthest from that distribution center, and they would build a store there. And then they would start building slowly back toward the distribution center. So you basically planted your flag out in the middle of nowhere, but would become an area where a lot of people lived as suburbia sort of blossomed.
It was one day drive of a truck from the distribution center, right?
Yes. And so then at some point, they've got dozens of stores that are driving distance filled in this whole sort of radius back to the distribution center, so they could make a lot more margin because they could get the price down as much as possible because they could negotiate these huge discounts with vendors because they have the distribution center, which will send all those stores that are connected to it. It's a pretty brilliant methodology. And I don't really realize they invented this concept of a distribution center. I always forget that before Walmart, there was the franchise variety stores, but there really wasn't large-scale discount retail that used this sort of model.
So by 1990, Walmart passes Sears to become the largest retailer in America. And again, all through the 70s, all through the 80s, Kmart was the gorilla. And then by the early 90s, Kmart, which had been so dominant, they start really feeling the squeeze from Walmart because Walmart is now pretty much nationwide at this point.
Pretty much, but still not yet. In 1990, they finally opened a store in California. It took until 1992 for Oregon and 93 for Washington. So all these quote-unquote coastal elites who are like underrating Walmart, it's kind of for lack of exposure. The first store opened in Washington in 1993, and Amazon was founded in 1994.
Wow.
Of course, on the coasts and then in the big cities, you kind of don't feel the dominance of Walmart in the same way.
So Here's some really fun history that I had no idea about. In the mid to late 80s, Kmart is at the height of its power, the height of its pride, right before, Walmart is finally going to tip them over. During that time, they go on a sort of drunken acquisition spree. Did you know about this?
No.
So Kmart, between the mid 80s and the early 90s, acquired Sports Authority, Office Max, Builders Square, Walden Books, and Borders. And this just had all sorts of light bulbs going off in my head.
Kind of reminds me of the New York Times during that era, too.
Right. Knowing my tech history, knowing our tech history here on Acquired, Louis Borders, the CEO and founder of Borders Books, started Webvan during the tech bubble. And I always wondered, I was like, why on earth did Louis leave Borders that he started and was founder of and then go start this Webvan thing? It was because Kmart bought his company.
Wow. I never knew what happened to Borders.
And so by the time, like kind of early mid 90s, when the writing's on the wall, Kmart starts selling off all of these acquisitions that they had made to just try and raise cash. They ultimately file for bankruptcy in January of 2002. And then in 2004, Kmart and Sears merge.
Wait, Kmart and Sears merged?
Yes, in 2004. We're going to take these two legacy, previously biggest retailers out there, storied brands, and we're going to merge them together and it's going to work. And I, vaguely was aware of this and I thought like, oh, well, duh, Amazon killed them all. No, Walmart killed them. There's no way that Kmart or God forbid Sears at that point could compete against Walmart. So that combined entity itself went bankrupt in 2018. But Walmart, by this point in time, this is like the Sony PlayStation version of Walmart, like the last big hurrah. They had launched the super centers.
Who got the truth? Is it you? Is it you? Is it you? Sit me down, say it straight. Another story on the way. Who got the truth? Who got the truth now?